Graham Perrett, your committee has inquired into both the two bills, the Bant-Wilkie bill and the Stephen Jones bill, both of which advocate changing the Marriage Act to allow same-sex marriage. Will your report recommend one or both bills be supported? What's going to be the finding here?
Well, Fran, because I can't actually reveal everything until 12:45 today, I can talk more of a general nature, but it's certainly the committee took the approach of looking at the efficacy of the legislation from Bant-Wilkie and from Jones in terms of if the Parliament was inclined to support same-sex marriage, which bit of the legislation or which bit of legislation would best achieve that.
You had a massive response from the community to this inquiry. An online survey conducted by the inquiry found 64% support for same-sex marriage. Did that result surprise you?
Well, it's the largest response received in the history of the federal parliamentary committees, I'm reliably informed. So, yes, it was. 276,437 Australians took the time to respond. So 1 in 81 Australians took the time to respond to this inquiry. So it is obviously something that Australians feel passionately about, either for change or against change.
And your inquiry received more than 2,500 submissions and comments too, so more than just responding to an online survey. That, as I say, a massive response. And it's a divisive issue. In terms of the submissions and comments, how will your report reflect those and inform the debate?
Well, we stripped it down, the lawyers on the committee, and there's a broad range of views on the committee, and we included Adam Bant as a non-voting member for the purposes of the inquiry as well. So, you had the two factions in the Labor Party, the broad range of views in the Liberal and Liberal National Party, and a Greens member sitting down in a room together to come up with a consensus view. And we were able to do that by focusing on the legislation in a dry, empirical, legalistic way to try and come up with a recommendation to the Parliament.
So focusing on the legislation in a dry, empirical, legalistic way must be difficult in a case like this where the evidence is anything but dry and empirical. It's emotional and emotive and heartfelt and personal, isn't it?
Very much so. And it certainly, when I read through, I should say I did not read through all 276,000 responses, but reading through the sample provided by the Secretariat, for as I said, between the passionately for and passionately against, it is quite moving. From as a lawyer, obviously I can look at it quite dryly, but as a person, as a member of Parliament, as someone representing my constituency, my electorate, it is quite moving when you hear these tales of how people feel about marriage, either the fact that they can't marry the one they love, or the fear that same-sex people would marry. So, the people are passionate about this topic for a variety of reasons, and I respect that passion.
People are passionate on both sides, of course, and over the weekend church leaders took to the pulpits in Catholic churches, Anglican churches and Greek Orthodox churches, urging their congregation to lobby against same-sex marriage.
I didn't go to church on Sunday, Fran. I had my children, and it's not really a very religious experience when I take a 3-year-old to church, so I stayed away on Sunday. But I am told, I did talk to one of the local priests in my electorate who had some comments to say on it, and I think that might have been a particularly more passionately embraced project in Sydney rather than in Brisbane.
Okay. You're on the public record supporting same-sex marriage rights. That is the position you're coming from.
Yeah.
Was there anything, and from what you've just said, you were moved, or certainly some of the responses on the online survey made an impression on you. Was there anything in the submissions and the evidence that you read that made you rethink your position or see the other side differently of this debate?
Well, I worked in Christian schools as a union organiser for the Independent Education Union for 5 years. So I've spent a lot of time in Christian schools. I've got Christian schools in my electorate. And by Christian, I mean not Catholic.
Yes.
So I spent a lot of times talking to Christians and having my career. And so this inquiry was part of that process. I do understand the passion that people feel about this, but I do try to strip it down to a logical approach. The greatest good to the greatest number of people. Who will this harm? That's what politicians are paid to do. We don't abdicate our responsibility based on surveys or polls. We have to look at the information, make a decision, and that's how I approached it. And that's, you can take me outside and give me a flogging if I ever failed to do that in my job as a politician.
So for you, is it more than just a straight out issue of equity? You're prepared to look beyond that and go to the arguments about, as you say, who will this harm, who will this protect?
Well, equity is obviously one of the platforms in which the Australian government sits on. That we believe in equality for all. Obviously, when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, there weren't a lot of women there. There probably weren't a lot of, that we know of, a lot of same-sex attracted people at the constitutional debates. Nevertheless, there's still always that common sense approach to it, and that's my faith guides me, but common sense informs what I do as a politician. So it wasn't that complicated. That said, there were people in that room, in that committee, both even in the same party as me, that have completely different, the same process but come up with a different outcome. So it's quite a delicious conundrum that we have, but nevertheless, that's how we approach our job.
Delicious and so personal for so many. It's 13 to 8 on breakfast. Our guest this morning is MP Graham Perrett, who's also the chair of the committee, which will release its reports into the Marriage Act, 2 bills championing same-sex marriage. That'll be released this afternoon. Graham Perrett, have your own personal circumstances affected your thinking? I think I'm right in saying you are a Catholic and you have 2 gay brothers, is that right?
Yes.
Does that give you, do you think, a unique insight into this issue?
No, I think, the 22.5 million Australians would all have their own perspectives. The 5 million Catholics in Australia don't all necessarily speak with the one voice of Archbishop Pell, that's for sure. I was approached by lots of Catholics in my own church, who had different views to those espoused by the church leaders. That's what faith is. It's a personal thing, a personal relationship with God. Or for those that don't have faith, it's a personal process as well.
Do you think when MPs come to the time to vote on these bills, they will be, or one or other of these bills, they will be voting according to their own conscience and their own personal beliefs and circumstances, or to reflect their constituency? And in your case, your seat of Moreton in a metropolitan Brisbane, you did survey your constituents, and 53% supported changing the Marriage Act, 44% opposed.
Well, and that was not a correct process. I mean, that was not a random survey. It was self-selecting. So as, I said 1 in 81 Australians responded. Well, there'll be 80 people in the middle of that process who didn't respond. So, and likewise, I wrote to everyone I could find in my electorate, every group that I thought would be interested. But the reality is the vast majority of Australians in the middle don't respond to these surveys. They don't. They just get on with their lives, get on with their relationships with their loved ones. So I think some of the more random polls of people have come up with about 60 to 67% from memory that do support a change. So that would be a more indicative guide. Look, but as I said, I don't abdicate my responsibilities as a politician and say, well, what did the polls say? I need to make a decision based on my conscience and based on my reading of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and throw in there the question of harm. Who would be harmed if I voted a certain way?
Dozens of MPs, perhaps as many as 60 or more, are still to declare their hands. Would you expect many of those people to change the way they're sort of leaning on this as they hear some of the arguments, or because as the numbers stand, this vote will fail? Do you expect this vote to fail?
Well, look, I heard a lot of the speeches when people were asked to report back what their electorate thought, and I heard people stand up and say 100% of the people in my electorate support keeping the definition of marriage the way it is. Now, that's just bunkum. That's rubbish. There's all we know. We know that there's a broad range of views in Australia. There always has been in that progression, that proud progression that Australia has towards being a progressive nation. I would think that this is a logical historical progression, personally, towards recognition of equality in marriage.
And what will be your feeling if this vote goes down? What will you feel?
Well, I think history will march on. You know, the reality is if Mr Abbott dictates what the conscience of Liberal MPs is, I'm not sure if I got the tense right there, well, then the vote will go down. But I think history will march on, and I look forward to being on the right side of history in this. And it's the best way to protect committed, monogamous relationships. That's the institution called marriage.
Graham Perrett, thank you very much for joining us on Breakfast.
Thanks, Fran.
Graham Perrett is a Labor MP who's the chair of the parliamentary inquiry into the private members' bills proposing same-sex marriage.